The Edmonton Oilers have gotten by with a makeshift goalie tandem in Stuart Skinner and Calvin Pickard. Is there an argument to add a third goalie to the mix ahead of March 5th's NHL trade deadline? On today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is sponsored by our friends over at FanDuel. New customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. So on today's show, a wide-ranging conversation about the Oilers' goaltending situation, arguments for and against adding a third goalie to the mix, what I think they should do, and we'll set the table for the rest of the week's shows. So at the outset, let's start with the big picture and the large drop-down view. We all know that the Oilers have prioritized other position groups. They've spent money tactically on other places because they feel that's more important. And one of the things I find beautiful about hockey is that we've yet to reach an ideal roster construction. We don't have a cookie cutter mold that every team replicates as far as what they spend money on. You know, there are some ideas like paying your superstar players to keep them as long as you can that are pretty prevalent, that if you get one of the 10 to 20 guys who can swing a game by themselves, you pay whatever they're asking for because there are so few of those guys. But the further removed you get from that, the more volatility you are associating with your team. And the Oilers have chosen, and I shouldn't even say chosen, the Oilers have stumbled into a goalie tandem in Stuart Skinner and Calvin Pickard that is very makeshift. That is very much not what was drawn up. You know, you got to go back a couple years to the Jack Campbell free agency situation where Campbell had played more games in that walk year as a Maple Leaf than he'd played basically at any point in his NHL career. And it was a really tactical risk that the Oilers were willing to take, that even though he hadn't had a huge track record, he hadn't really been a bell cow starter other than that one season in Toronto, which did wear him down, and he did ultimately get hurt in Toronto before going back, playing in the playoffs, whatever. He was never a slam dunk. You know, the great goalies, they don't really hit free agency. Sergei Bobrovsky, extreme outlier situation where it was kind of a perfect storm of situational factors where Columbus wasn't going to be able to keep him and he didn't want to stay there. So he was going to be able to maximize his value easily, the best goalie to reach unrestricted free agency during the salary cap era. And when you think about it, the Oilers got lucky. And I don't want to say that Stuart Skinner is a long-term solution to the position because, frankly, I don't know. He just doesn't have enough of a track record for me to feel confident in saying one way or another. I think right now, as we sit here in February of 2025, I think Stuart Skinner would be best situated or best served by being in a tandem. I think if the Oilers had the capacity to get a true 1B goalie who could play 30 to 40 games in complement or in support of Skinner, I think people would feel a lot better about the goalie room at large. And this is not a knock on Calvin Pickard. It's just that the Oilers, again, similar to Skinner, they kind of stumbled into Pickard. He hadn't played a lot prior to last year. I want to say he hadn't played consistently in the NHL for several seasons prior to last year, where he finally got some serious run. And I am looking at my notes here. I am doing a very bad job of radio. Hang on. But as far as this conversation, yeah, prior to 23-24, which was last year, his 23 starts, Pickard hadn't made more than 20 starts at the NHL level since 2016-2017. This is somebody who had spent time in a European league during COVID, somebody who'd been a spot starter for the Red Wings a couple times, but mostly had been an NHL goalie since the wheels came off in Colorado and he ended up moving on. That's not the track record or, frankly, the profile of what you want in a backup goalie on a Stanley Cup contender. And this is really a difficult proposition. And this is the exact same conversation we have in the NFL about backup quarterbacks. A lot of people will very anecdotally say, well, if you think you're good enough to win the championship, you need to have a backup goalie or backup quarterback who can come in and win games for you. And the problem with that supposition is there aren't 32 good starting goalies in the NHL, let alone enough quality goalies to be good backups. So much of the goaltending position is environmental. You know, it's very reminiscent of the conversation about running backs in the NFL, where unless you have, you know, Saquon or Derrick Henry, Jahmyr Gibbs, unless you have one of those guys who can genuinely capitalize on the environment in front of him, for the most part, you're going to be what your environment is. And we've seen great goalies get undone by bad teams in front of them. You could make an argument that's what's going on in Nashville right now with Nick Zararis, who has the profile and track record of an elite goalie, but is having a rough go of it this year. And I think in the case of Pickard and in Skinner, they both are a best case scenario in terms of a totally unfortunate or unpredictable situation. When the Oilers were absolutely up the creek with Jack Campbell a couple years ago, stumbling into Stuart Skinner, who was able to play passable NHL goalie to the tune of winning 35, 40 games. That's nothing short of a miracle that somebody with Skinner's track record was able to step in immediately and play well enough on a regular season team to have a good regular season. Ditto last year. And I don't know what the future of the goaltending position holds as far as this middle class. I think Stuart Skinner is firmly in the middle tier of NHL goalies. I don't think he's great. I think he can occasionally be very good. I don't think he's awful. But that volatility, that up and down, a lot of people who, if you don't watch on a nightly basis or you only catch games sparingly, you see the box score stats, excuse me, they're tripped over my words. You see the box score stats, you see the goals saved above expected, and you're very unimpressed. You're underwhelmed. And you see the track record against good opponents in the regular season. Both Pickard and Skinner have pretty rough numbers this year in the regular season in their matchups against teams that are going to make the playoffs. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But at the same time, you have last year's playoff as proof of concept. Now, to start transitioning our conversation to the next segment as a nice tease in, just because someone did something once, especially in sports, does not mean they're going to do it again. There, as we've talked about a lot this season in regards to Zach Hyman's 50 goals last year, outlier seasons do happen. And last year's playoffs very well might have been an outlier for Stuart Skinner. We're going to take our first break of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we'll give you the negative position. The Oilers don't need to go out and get a third goalie coming up next. So be sure to stick around. Super Bowl 59 is here. One game, Chiefs, Eagles, rematch. And there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling Super Bowl MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. The live betting feature makes it easy to stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing that you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, icing on the cake. The odds, they haven't changed. The Chiefs, 1.5-point favorites to go for the three-peat. So if you want to get in on the action, download the FanDuel app or head over to FanDuel.com to get started. Bet $5, and if you win, you can score $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official sports partner of Super Bowl 59. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers ahead of the Oilers showdown against the St. Louis Blues. We'll have a bonus episode for you guys this week. Haley Simon of Locked On Blues will stop by. We'll talk about the seasons. We'll talk about how Dylan Holloway and Philip Broberg have acclimated to St. Louis. how the Oilers have mitigated those losses and opened things up to a little bit more of an open-ended conversation as opposed to me just giving you my theories, because it's always good to get more evidence and more anecdotes and just try and expand your perspective. And I was having this conversation with one of my friends over the weekend about something entirely different, but all of our perspectives are largely formed on our life experiences. Now, if you're a nerd like me, you read a lot, you watch a lot of movies, you watch a lot of documentaries, you form more detailed opinions, and you can aggregate other people's thoughts and ideas in the path of formulating your own, what type of person you want to be, your ethics, your principles. But we're largely products of our environments, and what we take away from our experiences formulate how we think about things. And in this case, in talking about goaltending, so much of my understanding of the position stems from having Henrik Lundqvist and Igor Shesterkin as omnipresent figures in my life. And when you live at the top end of the food chain, where you have the franchise goalie, it enables you and it gives you a real appreciation for just how hard it is to find just a good starter, let alone a great one. And I get into arguments all the time with people who think that the Shesterkin contract is going to age poorly, that the Henrik Lundqvist contract aged poorly. If you don't want to pay the top of the market rate for goaltending, you need to have a better team in front of your goalie. If you want to have a rotational goalie, you want to do the tandem, you got to have a really, really good team in front of them to mitigate their responsibility. And the Rangers throughout my life have shown no adeptness at developing a well-rounded quality roster to make the goalie's life easier. The Oilers have developed a roster, and there are holes, there are weaknesses, there are strengths, just like any team, but the Oilers have supposed that the difference between Stuart Skinner and the next level up of goalie, if you want to say someone like Aiden Hill, Jordan Binnington, not top 5, but probably closer to top 10. If you want to say someone in that group is probably the next level up, the Oilers suppose that they are better off spending the price difference between those positions, about $2.5-3 million per year on another middle six forward or on a bottom pair defenseman, because those guys have a more direct and material way of impacting the game than a goalie does. Goalie is a regressive position in the sense that all a goalie can ever do is keep the game at 0-0. A goalie cannot score goals as well. And it's part of why evaluating defense and putting a price on defense in hockey is so challenging, because it's a negative, it's a regressive. You're trying to prevent something, and it's hard to measure how well you prevent something. That's what makes the goalie position tricky to price and to evaluate. But the argument for the Oilers not adding is mostly non-tangible. It is mostly based on Skinner and Pickard were there last year. Pickard showed you in a pinch, he can give you a spot start. He can give you a chance to win in a playoff game. And when Pickard plays, the stats bear out that the Oilers are a better defensive team. We did that episode back in November. I do want to revisit that idea now that we have more games to work on in our sample. But anecdotally, it does feel like the Oilers play better in front of Pickard than they do in front of Skinner. And that's part of the mental trick of knowing, well, it's our backup goalie. We got to do a better job. And building off of that, I think the strongest argument against going out and adding a goalie is that it is so hard to get a goalie acclimated. And especially if you are going to trade for someone who is ostensibly going to be a backup, who's only getting every third start or the second half of back-to-backs, that is not a role that's easy for someone who's been a starter to get themselves mentally adjusted to. Goalies in particular are such creatures of habit. And for the most part, goalies across hockey, the more games in a streak you can give them, 4 or 5 starts in a row, the better they're going to be by that third or fourth start, because so much of the position is anticipatory and muscle memory. And if you can make the play, it's going to unlock things for you. And you get on a nice roll, you build your confidence, you feel better about your game. And going out at what is a seller's market, there is a real dearth of talent, especially now that Mikko Rantanen and JT Miller and Marcus Pettersson have all been traded, and it's not even close. We're still a month and a day away from the NHL trade deadline. With all of those pieces off the board, you're looking at what? Brock Nelson as the most impactful player who's available ahead of this trade deadline. That does not feel like the type of trade market that's going to be conducive to specialized additions. And backup goalie is a specialized addition. Paying an asset on the hunch that you might need them down the road, that's not a luxury every team is going to pay for. You make an argument the Oilers are barely putting any effort in that position at all based on what they're paying Pickard. When you have a backup goalie who you effectively pulled out of obscurity, out of the AHL, and he's overperformed relative to your expectations, he's given you a chance to win. And look, wins are not a goalie stat. I want to be clear about that. Wins are not a goalie stat. And 4 guys who are just good enough to not hurt their team, the conversation around them is always going to be challenging. It's hard for me to sit here and say, well, it's not like Pickard's good when he has the win-loss record he does. And the guys on the team, hockey players in the NHL, they're not worried about scoring chances for and against, expected goals. They only care about, did they win or did they lose? They don't even care if the way they won is replicable or if they had bad luck or what have you. They really only care about winning and losing by any means necessary. So getting hung up on the details of it, you're never going to convince a guy that, hey, I know your goalie has a great record, but he's actually not that good, because that's not how hockey players' brains work. They think about being in the fight. That guy's in the fight with them. He's on their side. He's helped them win games. And that's the end of the conversation. But the real problem here for the Oilers, and we'll tie this into the final segment, there's not really a lot of great backups out there available. There's just not a lot of quality at that position group to begin with. And the teams that do have good backups are mostly in playoff spots, and they're not going to want to trade away someone who's an integral part of their lineup, especially down the back half of the regular season, where you're going to want to load manage your starting goalie a little bit more and give your starter extra time off to ramp them up, because we all know how volatile the playoffs are. Being as fresh as you can be is vitally important to the success of a team's playoff run. And I think we've seen the end of the true bell cow, the 65 starter that I think Henrik Lundqvist, Roberto Luongo, Marty Brodeur, the last reel of that ilk who are going to get that many starts. I think the position has changed. I think the athletic demands have changed. And because of that, it's just too physically demanding to ask a guy to make that many starts and then to be effective in the postseason. It's just not tangible. Not tangible, not realistic. It's not feasible to ask. We're going to take one more break on today's show. When we come back, we'll tie a bow on this episode as to whether or not the Oilers should go get a third goalie and a whole lot more. So be sure to stick around. And thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers ahead of the Oilers showdown against the Blues. Like I said, there'll be a second episode at some point later today that'll go out with Haley Simon talking about the Oilers and Blues, their respective seasons ahead of the game. A little bit of extra content. Always good to do crossover episodes, because the more perspectives you can gain, more informed perspectives you can gain, the better. But as for our goalie question, our goalie conundrum, the position is in a weird place market-wise, because with so few quality players at the position, teams often have to talk themselves into paying for a goalie. The Bruins went down to the wire. They didn't have Jeremy Swayman under contract until the first day of the season, and his season has been one long game of catch-up because didn't have a training camp, didn't have a preseason, and no matter what you do on your own time, privately working out, it's never going to be the same as formal team stuff. So that's a consideration. The Shesterkin contract, the UC Saros contract, the Connor Hellebuck contract. At the top of the market, you're getting to a significant price point. And yes, the salary cap is going to increase over the next handful of seasons, more in line with what it should be. And players are going to be eager to make up for lost opportunities. There are there's a good pocket of the league right now that's only ever operated in very reduced environments in terms of overall salary. You know, the NHL came out of that lockout in 2012, 2013 with a salary cap of like $44 million. And 10 years later, it has doubled, but at the same time, the NFL salary cap's like $250 million. The NBA salary cap's almost over $200 million. And the NBA, they have like 12 guys who dress on a game night. And I know there'll be people who say, well, why would you want to be like the NBA? It's not that I want to be like the NBA. It's that it'd be good if the athletes got paid like they deserve. You know, I'm never going to begrudge a guy looking to get paid. That's the goal here. As much as, you know, chasing a dream, Stanley Cup, Olympic medals, glory, Hall of Fame, all that good stuff. Family can't eat trophies. You got to make your money while you can. And for NHLers in this environment where the cap is going to balloon, it's a good thing that they're going to get paid. Now, of course, there are going to be bad contracts and teams are going to be, players, I should say, are going to be vilified for taking more money than they should, than their market value from teams who are poorly run or aren't as financially adept as others. But I personally feel that in a vacuum, if price for no object, the Oilers absolutely need to go out and get a backup goalie that is better than Calvin Pickard. That's not a knock on Pickard. It's when you see what's happened to teams who have good rosters, you know, the Penguins in 2022 come to mind, where they had to start Louis Domingue for 5 of the 6 games against the Rangers. They ultimately lost that series. They rushed Tristan Jarry back. He started game 7 well before he should have been playing hockey. The Avalanche a couple years ago, where they were down to Pavel Francois after their first 2 goalies on the depth chart got injured. Heck, I mean, think about the Dallas Stars getting to the Stanley Cup final in 2020 with Anton Khudobin as their starter effectively because they had suffered multiple injuries to that position group. You can never have enough depth. Depth is the single most important trait to look for in an organization when you're trying to win a championship, because there will be injuries. Players will underperform. You want to have opportunities. And yes, the Oilers got very, very fortunate that Calvin Pickard was able to answer the call in the one start they gave him last year against the Canucks. But I do not think the Oilers would be capable of going on a sustained playoff run if they had to start Calvin Pickard several games or for an entire series. I just don't think that's a feasible way. You think about the opponents they're going to run into, sure, you might play LA again in the first round, and maybe against LA you would have a chance of winning with Calvin Pickard. But big picture, in terms of pursuing the team's first Stanley Cup in more than 30 years, the need for a steady backup is real. The problem, of course, as we just discussed, there's no real obvious candidates. Well, I shouldn't say that. I personally feel that Jonathan Quick of the Rangers would be the perfect type of addition, somebody who has championship experience, somebody who's perfectly capable of being a backup, someone who has been a backup to a younger goalie who has a bit more of a leash, and somebody who Skinner would be able to lean on. The problem is twofold. Number one, I think Jonathan Quick envisions himself retiring after this year. He hit the 400 win mark, first American to get there Sunday night against the Vegas Golden Knights. I think he is very happy to be back on the East Coast where he's from. He's from Connecticut. His family's from there. He's holed up there, living there now, even though, you know, the Rangers play in the city. He's a good hour and a half, 2 hours away. But all of that said, Quick is the most obvious one. I don't think the Rangers are going to punt on the season in trading away their backup goalie, even though it would probably behoove them to get Dylan Garand, their AHL goalie who represented them in the AHL All-Star game over the weekend, some starts. I think it would make a lot of sense, but I don't think Quick wants to leave at this point. I think he wants to ride it out in New York. Other than that, Cam Talbot, Alex Lyon, one of those two, if Detroit cools off, even though Detroit's in a playoff spot right now, I could see that. I don't really have a ton of interest in like Ville Husso or someone like Phoenix Copley. There's just not a lot of quality backups. You know, the one goalie who interests me to some degree is Karel Velmuka of the Utah Hockey Club, who's put together good underlying numbers in terms of goals saved above expected on bad defensive teams, even though his save and goals against average are both pretty poor on Utah this year. I think he's someone who could play closer to a third of the games as opposed to a quarter of the games like Pickard is. I think he probably would look a lot better in the Oilers system. The problem is twofold. Number one, I don't think Utah's going to trade away their starting goalie in conference. Number two, I think the price point would probably be a bit of a non-starter because there were just so few quality goalies out there. I don't think they're going to be affable or agreeable to minimal compensation. It is a seller's market out there. If you have a valuable asset, you're going to get something nice for it. You know, the Penguins got a first-round pick for Marcus Pettersson, who's fine, but probably isn't a first-pair defenseman, and that just strikes me as crazy. But big picture, this is not a necessity. I'm pretty confident the Oilers aren't going to go out and add a third goalie, even though I think it would help them a lot. I do think it would help. I really, in my heart, I worry about this goalie tandem down the stretch. I worry about the miles. I worry about the moment and the environments, especially once you cut the playoff time. And the other point is, one of these guys gets hurt. You're talking about a totally unproven third goalie having to step up in the postseason just because of where the organizational depth being where it's at. The Oilers haven't prioritized goalie over the last 2 seasons. I imagine they're not going to be interested in committing money to anybody out there in free agency other than in a backup role, just because of where their money is tied up right now. You know, they have more important players that are worth the money they're getting. So they're going to be more inclined to try to patch together a goalie room the way the Leafs have, the way the Hurricanes have, where if you don't have one of those foundational goalies, you know, you don't have Shesterkin or Bob or Vasilevsky or Saros or Ottinger or Hellebuck, if you don't have one of those guys, you're going to be a lot more inclined to say, let's see if we can figure this out. And I think we're better off spending our money elsewhere on the roster, just because that's the nature of the position. If you don't have a great guy, you don't want to tie up money in an average starter. That's just not great cost efficiency. But that'll do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please throw the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell, get a notification whenever new content goes live. I will talk to you guys later today where Haley Simon will do Oilers Blues crossover. And then tonight, after the game against the Blues, whole lot of content coming at you real quick. So be sure to tune in. I will talk to you guys then. Until then, let's go Oilers.